Three men attacked the Vampire King in a crowded restaurant, blades out, chairs flying. Everyone thought it was over when one blade caught his throat. What no one knew, the waitress refilling water had been trained by a forgotten vampire hunter order, and her knife work turned the ambush into his salvation. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Mara had been watching Table 7 all night because rich men who ate alone always tipped either magnificently or not at all, and she needed to know which type Kieran Nocturne was before she wasted her best service smile on him. But now she was watching, because three men in suits that cost more than her car had just entered through three different doors with the kind of timing that made her spine go cold and her right hand drift toward the knife strapped to her thigh beneath her black apron. The Vampire King didn't notice, too focused on cutting into a steak so rare it still bled onto the white tablecloth, and Mara felt her training kick in like muscle memory as she moved toward his table with the water pitcher held in both hands, because Elena had taught her that any object could be a weapon if you committed to the swing. And right now, every instinct she'd honed in the underground archive was screaming that these men were here to kill. She was 3 steps away when they moved, synchronized and brutal, blades appearing in their hands like magic. Except Mara knew exactly what those blades were, because she'd trained with their twins for 5 years under fluorescent lights that flickered and buzzed, while Elena traced sigils onto silver with a steady hand and told stories about vampires who'd forgotten they could die. The blade that caught Nocturne's throat was inscribed with binding marks in a language most people thought was dead, and Mara watched his blood spray across the wineglass and the linen and her own white shirt, watched it run darker than human blood, almost black in the amber light of the crystal chandeliers, and she saw his eyes go wide, not with pain, but with shock, like he'd forgotten what it felt like to be mortal and breakable. The nearest attacker was already pivoting toward her because she'd seen too much and Mara didn't think, just swung the water pitcher in a flat arc that connected with his temple hard enough to shatter glass and bone, and his blade was falling, and she caught it midair the way Elena had made her practice 1,000 times with wooden dowels in the dusty archive until her fingers could find the grip blind. The second attacker lunged for Nocturne's heart, and Mara drove the captured blade through his shoulder instead of his throat because kill shots were permanent, and she didn't know yet who'd hired these men or why, just that they had hunter weapons and hunter training, and that meant someone was playing a game she didn't understand. The third man was faster, his blade already moving toward Nocturne's chest, and Mara's own knife was in her hand before she registered the decision, the bone handle warm against her palm as she threw herself between the vampire and the strike. Metal met metal an inch from Nocturne's heart, and the impact sang up her arm and into her shoulder, and she locked her elbow and held, watching the attacker's eyes go wide as he recognized the dragon sigil carved into her blade's crossguard. The restaurant exploded into screaming, the kind of high-pitched panic that came when civilians realized the violence they were watching wasn't a movie or a mistake, but something real and immediate and hungry. Chairs crashed over as people stampeded for the exits. Tables overturned and sent wine glasses shattering across marble floors. And somewhere a woman was crying in harsh, desperate sobs that cut through the chaos like a knife. Mara kept her blade locked against the attackers, kept her body between him and Nocturne, and with her free hand she pressed against the Vampire King's throat, where blood was still pumping out in thick, dark pulses that smelled like old metal and winter. The wound was smoking where the blessed silver had cut him, and she could see black veins spreading from the gash like poison working its way toward his heart. She spoke in Old Church Slavonic, the language Elena had taught her for rituals and bindings and last rites, and the words came out cold and clear despite the adrenaline making her hands shake. "The wound is blessed," she said. "Don't move." Nocturne's eyes locked onto hers, and she watched recognition flood through them, watched fear follow half a second later, the kind of fear that came from being known and named and seen for exactly what you were. The attacker she'd been holding back tried to press forward, and Mara twisted her wrist, used his momentum against him, sent his own blade sliding across his ribs in a cut that would hurt but not kill. He stumbled back and she kicked his knee, felt it pop, put him on the ground. The other two attackers were struggling to rise, the one she'd hit with the pitcher clutching his bleeding head, the one she'd stabbed through the shoulder trying to pull the blade free with shaking fingers. Emergency lights kicked on and bathed everything in red like the whole restaurant had been dipped in blood. Sirens were wailing in the distance, getting closer. And Mara knew she had maybe 90 seconds before police arrived and started asking questions she couldn't answer. "You know what I am," Nocturne said, and his voice was hoarse and shocked and smaller than she'd expected from a man who supposedly ruled half the vampires in Manhattan. "Everyone here knows what you are," Mara told him in English, switching languages like changing masks, keeping her voice flat and professional even though her heart was trying to punch through her ribs. "You're the man who just got attacked, Mr. Nocturne, and I'm calling 911. His hand shot out and caught her wrist, and his skin was cold enough to burn, cold enough that she felt it through the adrenaline and the fear, and his grip was desperate in a way that made him seem almost human. "No," he said. "No authorities, please." The please broke something in her chest because vampires didn't say please, didn't beg, didn't look at waitresses with eyes that held 8 centuries of loneliness and fresh new terror. Mara should have let go, should have stepped back, should have finished what these attackers started and driven her bone-handled knife through his heart while he was weak and bleeding and vulnerable. Elena had died hunting his kind 3 months ago, throat torn out and body left in an alley like garbage, and Mara had sworn over her mentor's grave that she'd finish what the Ordo Draconis started, even if she was the last hunter left alive. But Nocturne's blood was hot against her palm, and his eyes were holding hers like he was drowning, and she was the only solid thing in reach. And somewhere under the vampire and the king and the monster was something that looked enough like a person that Mara's knife hand hesitated. The 3 attackers were moving again, trying to regroup, and Mara made a decision that would either save her life or end it. She pulled Nocturne to his feet, kept pressure on his throat with one hand, kept her knife ready in the other, and steered him toward the kitchen doors while the restaurant continued its spiral into chaos around them. The attackers tried to follow, but they were injured and slow, and Mara was neither. Years of training turning her movements efficient and brutal as she shouldered through the swinging doors into the kitchen where staff were huddled by the walk-in freezer with their phones out filming everything. She needed to get Nocturne somewhere safe, needed to figure out why she'd just violated every oath she'd ever sworn, needed to understand why saving a vampire felt less like betrayal and more like the first honest thing she'd done since Elena died. His blood was soaking through her shirt and his weight was getting heavier against her side, and the blessed silver was spreading its poison through his veins like fire. And Mara knew with the cold certainty of her training that if she didn't do something in the next 10 minutes, the Vampire King was going to die in a French restaurant in Manhattan with a waitress's hand pressed against his throat, and her knife ready to either save him or finish him, depending on which way the next 60 seconds fell. The police arrived in a flood of red and blue that turned the restaurant windows into a kaleidoscope, and Mara watched Kieran Nocturne make 3 phone calls in under 2 minutes, with the kind of calm that came from having enough money and power to bend an entire city to his will. The first call went to someone he addressed as commissioner, and the conversation lasted exactly 18 seconds. Nocturne's voice low and commanding, even with black blood still seeping through the napkins Mara had pressed against his throat. The second call went to someone named Bernard, who apparently owned Luminaire, and the third went to a number Nocturne didn't speak aloud, just selected from his favorites, and waited while it rang twice before a woman's voice answered, and he said simply, "Send Isla and a cleanup crew," then ended the call and looked at Mara with eyes that held too much intelligence and not enough trust. The police who entered weren't the ones Mara expected, not the patrol officers who'd respond to a 911 call about a stabbing, but detectives in suits who nodded at Nocturne like they knew him and started clearing the restaurant with efficient movements that suggested this wasn't their first time making a crime scene disappear. The 3 attackers were gone before Mara could process it, lifted by men in black tactical gear who moved through the kitchen like smoke and didn't bother with questions or ambulances, just zip ties and unmarked vans that pulled away from the service entrance while the detectives were still taking statements from sobbing waitstaff. Mara felt the trap closing around her with each passing second, felt her window for escape shrinking as Nocturne's people locked down every exit and controlled every witness. And when the woman named Isla arrived, Mara knew running was no longer an option. Isla was tall and cold-eyed with platinum hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and she assessed Mara the way a butcher assessed meat, clinical and thorough and utterly without warmth. She pulled Nocturne aside, spoke in rapid French that Mara's high school classes couldn't quite follow, and whatever she said made Nocturne glance at Mara with an expression that managed to be both curious and predatory. Then Isla was gripping Mara's elbow hard enough to bruise and steering her through the chaos toward the back office where managers counted register drawers and filled out incident reports. Except now the cramped space held only a folding chair, a filing cabinet, and 3 people who'd just watched Mara break every rule the Ordo Draconis had ever written. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting everything in the kind of harsh institutional glow that made everyone look sick, though Nocturne actually was sick, his throat wound still smoking where the blessed silver was eating through tissue that should have healed minutes ago. Mara could smell bleach and old coffee, and underneath it the iron tang of vampire blood, which wasn't supposed to smell different from human blood, but did, darker and colder and older somehow. Outside the locked door, police radios crackled with static, and official voices coordinating a cover story that would keep this off the news and out of the public record, and Mara felt her last hope of outside intervention die with a quiet click as Isla turned the deadbolt. Nocturne sat in the folding chair like it was a throne, his white shirt soaked black down the front, and despite the wound and the blood, and the way his hands shook slightly when he reached for the water bottle Isla handed him, he still carried himself with the kind of authority that came from centuries of being obeyed without question. "Who are you?" Isla asked, and it wasn't really a question so much as a demand wrapped in courtesy thin as paper. Mara said nobody, just a waitress, took some self-defense classes at the Y, saw the attack and reacted, didn't think about it. The lie tasted like ash on her tongue, and she watched both Isla and Nocturne recognize it for exactly what it was. Nocturne leaned forward, despite the pain the movement clearly cost him, and asked in a voice gone soft and dangerous where exactly she'd learned Old Church Slavonic, because that wasn't a language they taught at community centers between yoga and kickboxing. Mara said her grandmother was Romanian, taught her prayers when she was little. She barely remembered what the words meant. Nocturne's expression said he knew she was lying, and he was choosing not to push yet, choosing to let her keep her small fiction for now because he had bigger concerns than one waitress's family history. Isla wasn't as patient. She pulled out her phone, pulled up something on the screen, and started reading aloud from what Mara recognized with sinking dread as her hiring paperwork. Mara Chen, age 26, previous employment at a coffee shop in Brooklyn that went out of business 8 months ago, references from a landlord and a former roommate, social security number that checked out, background check that came back clean. Isla looked up from the screen and said, "Except it's all fabricated, isn't it? Because there's no digital footprint before 2023, no school records, no medical history, no presence at all until you appeared in New York fully formed, like you sprang from nowhere." Mara kept her face blank the way Elena had taught her, kept her breathing steady, kept her hands relaxed at her sides even though every instinct was screaming at her to run. Nocturne watched her with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall and could probably read lies the way normal people read street signs. "The Ordo Draconis has been extinct for 60 years, he said, and his voice held something that might have been grief or might have been satisfaction. "Who sent you?" Mara said no one sent me. "I'm just—" And Nocturne cut her off with a gesture that was somehow both elegant and brutal. "A waitress who carries a bone-handled knife with the dragon sigil and speaks the hunter's tongue fluently," he said, leaning closer despite the way the movement made fresh blood pulse from his throat. "No, you're either the last of them, or someone wants me to think you are, and either way, you're in danger now. From me, from whoever hired those men, and from whoever trained you to be a weapon and then abandoned you to this." The words hit harder than Mara expected, because abandoned was exactly how she'd felt since Elena died, left alone with half-finished training and a mission she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. "Help me survive the night," Nocturne said, and his voice had shifted from threat to something almost like partnership. "Then we negotiate." Mara felt the walls closing in, felt Isla's hand drift toward whatever weapon she kept concealed under her jacket, felt the weight of Nocturne's gaze holding her in place like a physical thing. "What's the ritual?" she asked quietly, and heard her own defeat in the words. "Blood exchange," Nocturne said. "Mine for yours. It's the only way to purge blessed silver." The words hit Mara like a physical blow because blood exchange was forbidden in Hunter doctrine. Was the line Elena had said could never be crossed because it bound you to the vampire in ways that went beyond physical, created connections that made betrayal harder and loyalty dangerous. Mara wanted to refuse, wanted to tell Nocturne and his cold-eyed security chief exactly what they could do with their ritual and their threats. But she'd seen what Isla kept under her jacket when the woman shifted her weight, and Mara knew with absolute certainty that refusing meant dying in this cramped office that smelled like bleach and fear. Nocturne was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that might have been curiosity or might have been respect, and when he spoke again, his voice had gentled slightly, like he understood exactly what he was asking her to sacrifice. "I know what your order taught you about blood exchange," he said. "I know you think it will corrupt you or bind you or make you something other than what you are. But the alternative is, I die from blessed silver poisoning, and whoever hired those men sends more attackers, and eventually they figure out you're the reason I survived tonight and they kill you too." He paused, let that sink in, then added, "We can hate each other after we survive. Deal." Mara thought about Elena's body in the morgue, thought about the vows she'd made to finish what her mentor started, thought about how saving this vampire had already violated that vow so thoroughly that one more transgression hardly mattered. Ela was still watching her like a hawk watches a mouse, and Mara could feel the exact moment the security chief decided Mara was more liability than asset and started calculating angles and exit wounds. "Fine," Mara said before Isla could make her decision permanent. "I'll do the ritual, but I want assurances. I want your word you won't kill me after." Nocturne's smile was sharp enough to cut. "You have my word," he said, and Mara knew the word of an 800-year-old vampire was probably worth less than nothing, but it was the best she was going to get. He pulled a business card from his wallet, wrote an address on the back in handwriting that looked like calligraphy, handed it to her with fingers that shook slightly from blood loss. "Midnight," he said. "Come alone, and if you run, I'll find you. Because now that I know what you are, I can't afford to let you disappear into the city with everything you know about me." The threat was delivered almost gently, but Mara heard the steel underneath and knew he meant every word. Isla unlocked the door, and Mara walked out into the restaurant that had been cleaned so thoroughly there was no evidence anything violent had happened at all, just overturned chairs being righted by staff who'd been told this was a robbery gone wrong, and everyone would get hazard pay if they kept quiet about the details. Mara's apron was still hanging on its hook by the kitchen, but her knife was in her hand, and the dragon sigil was catching the light as she walked past detectives who didn't ask her a single question. The address on the business card was uptown, the kind of neighborhood where doormen wore white gloves and buildings had names instead of numbers. And Mara had 3 hours to decide whether she was going to show up or disappear into the subway system and never surface again. She knew what Elena would have told her to do. Knew the hunter's oath by heart, knew that performing a blood exchange ritual with a vampire was the kind of betrayal that would make her mentor's ghost weep. But Elena was dead, and Mara was alive, and somewhere in the chaos of the last hour, she'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade, had chosen to save instead of kill, had looked into Kieran Nocturne's eyes and seen something that made her knife hand hesitate. She walked out of Luminaire into October air that smelled like car exhaust and roasted nuts from the street vendor on the corner, and the business card in her pocket felt heavy as an anchor dragging her toward a future she couldn't predict and probably wouldn't survive. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower that made Mara's stomach drop when she looked down at Manhattan sprawling beneath her like a circuit board of lights, and she had to press one hand against the floor-to-ceiling windows to convince herself the glass was solid and wouldn't send her tumbling into empty air. Kieran Nocturne was alone when he opened the door. No Isla with her cold eyes and concealed weapons. Just the Vampire King looking worse than he had 2 hours ago, the wound on his throat spreading black veins down past his collarbone and across his chest like poison ivy crawling over marble. He'd changed into a clean shirt, black silk that made his skin look even paler. And when he gestured for Mara to enter, she saw his hand shake slightly before he caught himself and steadied it. The apartment was exactly what she'd expected, and nothing like it at the same time. All clean lines and dark wood and empty spaces that felt more like a museum than a home, except for one wall covered floor to ceiling with books in leather bindings that looked older than the building itself. Mara recognized some of the languages from Elena's collection, Latin and Greek, and that same old church Slavonic she'd spoken in the restaurant, and the sight of them made her chest tighten because how many vampires kept hunter texts in their personal libraries? He'd prepared the ritual space in what should have been a living room, but held only bare hardwood floors, and those massive windows looking out at the city like they were floating above it. The circle was salt, pure white against dark wood, and inside it he'd placed candles that smelled like wolfsbane and rue, and something else Mara recognized as consecrated ash, the kind Elena used to burn at the end of particularly difficult hunts. 2 silver bowls sat in the center of the circle, polished until they caught candlelight and threw it back in fractured patterns. Nocturne explained the ritual in a voice gone rough with pain, told her the exchange required balance, his blood for hers, the magic would recognize the trade, and purge the blessing from his system if they did it right. Mara asked what happens if we do it wrong, and he said, "Then I die, and you'll be free of this," and she didn't understand why that answer made something twist in her chest like grief. She should want him dead, should be relieved at the possibility of his death. But looking at him standing in his circle of salt and candlelight with black veins crawling across his skin like cracks in porcelain, all she felt was a desperate need for this to work. He knelt in the circle and gestured for her to join him, and Mara crossed the salt line, feeling like she was crossing a border into a country she could never return from. The candles flickered when she entered, but didn't go out, and Nocturne reached for her wrist, with hands that were steadier now like he'd found some reserve of control and was clinging to it. He asked if she was ready, and Mara said no, but do it anyway, and she watched his pupils dilate as his fangs extended, longer than she'd expected, sharp enough to catch moonlight. The bite was pain first, bright and immediate. Then heat flooding up her arm and into her shoulder and chest like she'd been injected with something molten. She gasped and felt herself falling, except she wasn't moving, was still kneeling in the circle with Nocturne's mouth pressed against her wrist, but her mind was falling into darkness that opened up beneath her like a trapdoor. Then the memories hit. She saw a battlefield from centuries ago, men in armor hacking at each other with swords while arrows fell like rain, saw Nocturne younger and human and terrified as he drove a blade through someone's chest. She saw a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, saw Nocturne kiss her in a stone chapel while bells rang overhead, saw the same woman lying pale and still in a bed while Nocturne wept beside her. She saw the moment he was turned, saw the face of the vampire who'd promised him eternal life and delivered eternal isolation instead. Saw the betrayal in Nocturne's eyes when he realized what he'd become. Century after century of loneliness rolled through Mara's consciousness like waves, showed her Nocturne watching everyone he loved grow old and die, showed him building walls around himself until he forgot what it felt like to trust anyone. She gasped and tried to pull away, but Nocturne's grip on her wrist tightened, and she felt him go rigid as her own memories started flowing the other direction. He was seeing Elena now, seeing the underground archive where Mara had spent 5 years learning to kill vampires, seeing Elena's patient hands teaching her to carve sigils and mix holy water and find the vulnerable spots on creatures who'd forgotten they had any. He was seeing Elena's body 3 months ago, throat torn open and left in an alley like trash, seeing Mara kneel in spreading blood and make a vow she'd meant with every atom of her being. "I'll finish what you started," Mara had whispered over Elena's corpse. "I'll hunt every last one of them until they're extinct, or I am." Nocturne pulled back from her wrist, eyes wide and shocked, and whispered, "You were going to kill me tonight." Mara met his gaze and said, "Yes, I should have." And she meant it, even though her chest was still tight with the echo of his centuries of grief. "Your mentor," Nocturne said, voice rough and pained. "Elena Korovi. I knew her, 60 years ago." The words hit Mara like a physical blow, and she said, "That's impossible, she would have told me." But Nocturne was shaking his head. "We had a truce," he said. "She hunted the rogues. I left her territory alone. It held for decades." He paused, and Mara felt something shift in the air between them, felt the truth of his words settle into her bones with a weight that made her want to scream. "I didn't kill her, Mara," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth was startling and intimate. "I swear it on the blood we just shared." Mara wanted to call him a liar, wanted to pull her knife and finish what she'd come here to do, but the ritual had opened something between them, and she could feel his sincerity like a physical presence, could feel his horror at the idea that she thought he'd killed someone he'd respected. "Then who did?" she asked, and her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, almost breaking. "Someone who wanted you to think I did," Nocturne said, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because a hunter who believes she's avenging her mentor is a perfect weapon, aim her at your enemy and let her go." He paused, and Mara felt the question coming before he spoke it. "You were sent to kill me tonight, but you didn't. Why?" Mara opened her mouth to answer and realized she didn't know, couldn't explain the instinct that had made her save him instead of finishing him. "I don't know," she whispered, and felt the admission cost her something she couldn't name. The ritual required the second half now, and Nocturne gestured to his throat where the wound was still smoking, black veins having spread so far they looked like lightning frozen under his skin. Mara leaned forward and pressed her mouth to his throat and tasted blood that was nothing like human blood, colder and sharper and ancient. Like drinking liquid metal mixed with winter itself. The flavor should have disgusted her, but instead it sang through her system like electricity. Woke up parts of her she'd kept carefully dormant since Elena died. She felt Nocturne's memories continue flooding into her consciousness, saw the faces of people he'd loved and lost, saw the weight of centuries pressing down on him until he'd learned to carry it like Atlas carried the world. She saw his careful construction of power and influence, saw him build an empire in Manhattan, not because he wanted to rule, but because ruling meant controlling the rogues, meant keeping vampires from turning the city into a hunting ground that would expose them all. She saw his loneliness, vast and aching, and so familiar it made her want to weep, because she'd felt the same thing since Elena died. That sense of being the only one left who remembered what mattered. The black veins began to recede as she drank, pulling back from his collarbone and chest, like time-lapse footage of ice melting, and Mara felt the wound under her mouth start to close. She pulled back gasping and watched the last of the damaged tissue knit itself together until his throat was smooth and unmarked, and then something snapped into place between them like a rubber band pulled taut and released. The empathic link hit her like a wave, sudden and overwhelming, and she could feel Nocturne's exhaustion and shock and cautious relief as clearly as she felt her own emotions. He was feeling her too, she realized with growing horror, feeling her guilt and loneliness, and the fear that she'd just betrayed everything Elena had taught her. They broke apart, and the candles extinguished simultaneously, like someone had thrown a switch, leaving only moonlight streaming through the glass walls. Mara pressed her back against the windows and tried to catch her breath while Nocturne remained kneeling in the salt circle, both of them feeling each other's racing hearts and ragged breathing through the connection the ritual had forged. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they'd just seen and felt and learned about each other, and Mara wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. "The men who attacked me," Nocturne said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. "They didn't know what I was. They used hunter weapons, but they weren't hunters. Someone gave them your order's tools." Mara felt understanding dawn cold and terrible, felt the pieces click into place with the inevitability of a key turning in a lock. Someone is framing the Ordo Draconis, she said, and heard the horror in her own voice. Someone wants a war between vampires and the last hunter. Nocturne nodded slowly, and Mara felt his grim satisfaction through the link, felt him working through the implications the same way she was. Elena's death wasn't random, wasn't a rogue vampire losing control. It was planned, executed, designed to turn Mara into a weapon pointed straight at Nocturne's heart. Someone had killed her mentor and made it look like Nocturne's work, had left just enough evidence to convince Mara she knew who to blame, had set her on a collision course that should have ended with one or both of them dead tonight. Except Mara had saved him instead of killing him, and now they were bound by blood and magic and shared memories that made lying impossible. She could feel his growing protectiveness toward her through the link, could feel him trying to wall it off and failing because the empathic connection made hiding futile. He could feel her confusion and anger, and underneath it, the first stirrings of something that might have been attraction if she let herself examine it too closely. The city sprawled beneath them, millions of people going about their lives completely unaware that a war had almost started in a French restaurant and been averted by a waitress who'd made the wrong choice for reasons she still didn't understand. Mara looked at Nocturne across the salt circle and felt his exhaustion and relief, and the careful way he was guarding his thoughts, even though his emotions bled through the link like watercolors in rain. She thought about Elena's body in the morgue, thought about the vow she'd made, and how completely it had been based on lies, thought about whoever had orchestrated this whole thing and was probably watching even now to see if their weapon had found its target. "Your mentor and I held a truce for 60 years, Nocturne said quietly. "She was a good woman, Mara. She chose peace when war would have been easier, and someone killed her for it." Mara felt tears threatening and blinked them back because hunters didn't cry. Elena had taught her that. Except Elena had also taught her that all vampires were monsters, and that was turning out to be comprehensively untrue. The link between them hummed with shared grief and determination, and something else neither of them was ready to name, and Mara knew with cold certainty that her life had just divided into before and after. Before she'd saved a vampire king, and after she'd learned her entire mission was a lie. Nocturne stood slowly, testing his healed throat with careful fingers, and offered Mara his hand to help her up. She stared at it for a long moment, at his pale fingers and the black silk cuff of his shirt, and thought about how taking his hand was another choice, another step away from everything she'd been and toward something she couldn't predict. She took it, felt his cold grip close around hers. Let him pull her to her feet in the center of a salt circle that had just rewritten both their futures. Kieran's phone shattered the silence at 1:03 in the morning, and he knew before answering that the news would be bad because Isla only called at this hour, when something had gone catastrophically wrong. Her voice came through clipped and urgent, telling him security footage from 3 locations across Manhattan showed coordinated movement, vehicles converging on known safe houses, the Court of Ash mobilizing with the kind of precision that suggested they knew the ritual had succeeded and were moving to contingency plans. Kieran felt the information settle into his bones with the weight of 800 years of political maneuvering and knew the next attack wouldn't be subtle. Wouldn't be 3 mercenaries in a restaurant, but something designed to send a message written in blood and fire. He told Mara she needed to leave the city immediately. Told her he'd handle the court the way he'd been handling vampire politics since before her great-grandparents were born. But even as he said it, he felt her refusal through the empathic link like a wall slamming down between them. She said no with the kind of finality that allowed no argument, and explained that the Hunter archive beneath Grand Central contained records of every vampire faction in New York, that if someone had manipulated Elena's death, there would be evidence, paper trails and photographs and notes that Elena would have kept because she documented everything. Kieran insisted on going with her and felt through the link, her fear spiking sharp and immediate. Felt her conviction that she was walking into a trap, but also her desperate need to know the truth about her mentor's death. They argued in his penthouse while the city glittered below them, and the empathic link made lying impossible. made every emotion bleed through like ink on wet paper. He felt her terror at the thought of losing him and realized with something like shock that she cared whether he lived or died, that somewhere in the last 3 hours she'd stopped seeing him as a monster and started seeing him as a person worth protecting. She felt his own fear for her safety, felt how the thought of her dying made something in his chest constrict like a fist closing around his heart, and her eyes widened as she realized he would burn Manhattan to ash before he let the court take her. The argument ended in compromise the way most arguments between stubborn people did, with both of them getting part of what they wanted and neither getting everything. They would go to the archive together, but Mara would lead because it was her mentor's space and her history, and Kieran understood enough about grief to know she needed to be the one to uncover whatever truth waited there. They took his car, a black sedan with windows tinted dark enough to hide him from streetlights, and drove through Manhattan at an hour when the city belonged to taxi drivers and people stumbling home from bars. Kieran kept one hand on the wheel and felt through the link Mara's mixture of determination and dread, felt her bracing herself for whatever she might find in Elena's final records. In a brownstone in the West Village that had been converted into something between a throne room and a war room, Cassia Varn received the news that Kieran Nocturne had survived with the kind of cold fury that made the messenger take 3 steps backward. She was ancient even by vampire standards, turned during the reign of Charlemagne, and she'd spent 12 centuries perfecting the art of appearing elegant while planning atrocities. Her plan had been beautifully simple: hire human mercenaries and arm them with hunter weapons stolen from the Ordo Draconis archives that Cassia had been quietly looting for decades, wound Nocturne fatally with blessed silver, let the last hunter take the blame when he died, and the resulting war between vampires and hunters would eliminate both Nocturne's moderate faction and the troublesome hunter lineage in one efficient stroke. Instead, the hunter had saved him, had performed a blood ritual that should have been impossible because no trained hunter would ever exchange blood with a vampire, and now Cassia's careful plans were unraveling. She gave new orders to the 6 vampires kneeling before her throne, told them to find the girl and kill her in a way that looked like Nocturne's work, make it brutal and public and unmistakably vampiric, so that when Nocturne died afterward, everyone would believe he'd gone rogue and needed to be put down. "Kill her in a way that breaks him first," Cassia said, her voice soft and deadly. "Then kill him while he's grieving." Poetic, really. The vampires dispersed into the October night, and Cassia poured herself wine from a bottle older than the United States, and smiled because even if this plan failed, she had 6 more waiting in reserve. Kieran and Mara entered the subway tunnels beneath Grand Central through a maintenance door that Mara opened with a key she kept on the same chain as her apartment key, and the smell hit Kieran immediately: old paper and rat poison and the particular staleness of air that hadn't circulated properly in months. The archive sprawled through what had once been service tunnels and abandoned station platforms, rooms that the city had forgotten about when they'd rerouted the subway lines in the 70s. Fluorescent lights flickered to life when Mara hit the switches, casting everything in the kind of harsh industrial glow that made shadows sharp-edged and absolute. The walls were covered in maps, some contemporary and some decades old, showing vampire territories marked in different colored ink. Newspaper clippings documented attacks and disappearances going back 50 years. Photographs pinned to corkboards showed faces Kieran recognized, vampires he'd known and fought and occasionally killed, and seeing them through Elena's eyes was strange and disorienting. Then Mara stopped in front of one photograph, and Kieran felt her shock punch through the empathic link so hard it nearly staggered him. The photo was old, probably 30 years based on the colors and the camera quality, and it showed Elena Karovi shaking hands with a younger version of Kieran in what looked like a parking garage. They were both smiling slightly, the careful smiles of people who'd just negotiated a truce, neither entirely trusted, but both desperately needed. "Proof," Mara whispered, and Kieran heard her voice breaking on the word. Proof that everything she'd believed about her mentor and her mission and her purpose had been built on lies. "She never told me," Mara said, still staring at the photograph. "Why wouldn't she tell me you had a truce?" Kieran felt her pain through the link and chose his words carefully, because this moment mattered in ways that went beyond politics or survival. Because she knew what you'd think, he said. That she'd gone soft, betrayed the order, chose a vampire's word over hunter doctrine. He paused and looked at the photograph, at Elena's face, and felt grief rise up sharp and unexpected. She was the best of us, Mara. Human or vampire, she chose peace when war was easier. And they killed her for it, Mara said, and her voice had gone flat and cold in the way that meant she was about to break entirely. Kieran said yes, and felt her grief crash over both of them through the link, felt his own grief tangling with hers, until he couldn't tell where his ended and hers began. Mara moved deeper into the archive with the mechanical precision of someone trying not to feel, pulling open filing cabinets and sorting through papers with shaking hands. She found Elena's journal in a drawer marked personal, a leather-bound notebook filled with Elena's precise handwriting. Mara flipped to the last entry, and Kieran read over her shoulder, close enough that he could smell her shampoo and feel the warmth radiating from her skin. The entry was dated 3 months ago, and Kieran felt cold understanding spread through him as he read Elena's words. Cassia Varn requested a meeting, Elena had written. Says she has proof Kieran broke our truce. I don't believe her, but I have to investigate. If I don't return, Mara, trust no one, not even your instincts. The court plays long games. Cassia killed her, Kieran said quietly, and felt Mara's hands start to shake so hard the journal nearly fell. Cassia killed her and made it look like a rogue vampire attack so you'd come for me, so you'd finish what she started and eliminate us both. Mara's grief was a living thing between them, sharp enough to cut, and Kieran felt his own fury rising to match it, because Cassia had taken someone good and used her death as a weapon. Before he could say anything else, the lights cut out, all of them simultaneously, and the archive plunged into darkness so complete, Kieran's vampire vision needed 3 seconds to adjust. He heard movement in the tunnels, multiple footsteps echoing off tile and concrete, and knew with grim certainty that Cassia's hunters had found them faster than he'd expected. And they'll kill you too, Kieran started to say, but Mara cut him off with a question asked in the dark where his eyes glowed faintly gold, and hers were still adjusting to the absence of light. Unless what, she said, and he felt her fear through the link, felt her standing in the dark surrounded by her dead mentor's life's work, with killers closing in from 3 directions. Unless you let me help you fight, Kieran said, and reached out to take her hand, because his night vision was perfect, and hers was human limited, and the archive had become a maze of shadows and blind corners. Her fingers closed around his, warm and alive and trusting in a way that made his chest tighten. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, the steady plinking of ancient pipes leaking, and the footsteps were getting closer, 6 distinct sets of feet moving with predatory patience. Kieran pulled Mara behind him and felt through the link her stubborn resistance to being protected, warring with her practical understanding that he could see in the dark, and she couldn't. The first shadow detached from the tunnel entrance, and Kieran recognized the vampire, one of Cassia's lieutenants. A woman named Hela, who'd been turned during the French Revolution and had never quite gotten over her love of public executions. Hela smiled in the darkness and said, "Cassia sends her regards," and Kieran felt Mara's hand tighten in his as 5 more vampires stepped into view, and the archive that had been Elena's sanctuary became their battleground. The 6 assassins spread through the archive with the kind of coordinated precision that came from centuries of hunting together, and Mara felt her training kick in as she catalogued threats and advantages while her heart hammered against her ribs. 4 vampires and 2 human thralls, the thralls carrying UV lamps that cast harsh purple-white light across the walls and made Kieran hiss and pull back into the shadows. Mara's hand went to the knife strapped to her thigh, but she had more than that, had the vial of holy water she always kept in her jacket pocket, and the silver wire Elena had taught her to use as a garrote, and somewhere in this archive were stakes and blessed weapons that Elena had stockpiled for emergencies exactly like this. The nearest vampire lunged and Mara moved, years of muscle memory taking over as she grabbed a wooden stake from the wall display and drove it through his chest before he could register she'd armed herself. He crumbled to ash, and she was already spinning toward the next threat, toward a female vampire who'd been turned young enough that she still looked like a teenager, but moved with speed that blurred the air. Mara felt through the empathic link the moment Kieran took a hit from behind, felt his pain spike sharp and immediate, and she abandoned her current fight to cover his blind spot. She threw the holy water and watched it splash across the vampire's face, watched him scream and claw at skin that was bubbling and smoking. Kieran used the distraction to grab the vampire by the throat and snap his neck with a twist that was efficient and brutal, and through the link, Mara felt his gratitude and his growing fury at being forced to fight in a space that should have been safe. Kieran saw the human thrall raise the UV lamp and felt terror flood his system because UV light wouldn't kill him, but it would burn and blind and incapacitate, would leave him vulnerable while Mara fought alone against odds she couldn't beat. He tried to move out of the beam's path, but another vampire was on him, a man Kieran recognized from Cassia's inner circle, and the distraction cost him precious seconds. The UV light hit him full in the chest, and he felt his skin start to blister, felt the ancient instinct to flee from sunlight, even artificial sunlight override 8 centuries of control. Then Mara was there, throwing herself between Kieran and the lamp with a recklessness that made his heart stop. The light caught her instead, and Kieran heard her scream, smelled her skin burning, and something inside him that had been carefully controlled for centuries snapped clean in half. He tore through the thrall with his bare hands, didn't bother with efficiency or grace, just ripped the man apart with a brutality that splattered blood across Elena's carefully organized maps. The second thrall tried to run, and Kieran caught him by the spine and broke him like kindling. The remaining vampires hesitated, and Kieran felt their fear through centuries of predator instinct, knew they were recognizing him not as a king or a politician, but as something older and more dangerous than they'd ever be. Mara's arm was on fire, skin blistered and peeling where the UV light had caught her, but she pushed the pain down into a box the way Elena had taught her, and kept fighting. She grabbed a fragment of broken subway rail that had been decorating one wall, swung it like a baseball bat, caught a vampire across the throat hard enough that his head came off and tumbled across the concrete floor. The archive was destroying itself around them, maps shredding under clawed hands, glass shattering as bodies slammed into display cases. The smell of blood, both human and vampire, mixing with ozone and burnt flesh. Through the empathic link, she felt Kieran's protective fury burning so hot it threatened to consume them both, felt him moving through the remaining attackers with the kind of violence that should have terrified her, but instead felt like safety. They were outnumbered, but they were synchronized, moving around each other like dancers who'd practiced this routine 1,000 times. And every time Mara felt fear spike through her system, Kieran was there covering her before she could call out. The last vampire standing was Hela, and she'd backed away from the carnage with her hands raised in a gesture that might have been surrender if her eyes hadn't been calculating escape routes. "Cassia offers terms," Hela said, and her voice was smooth and cultured despite the blood splattered across her expensive coat. "Surrender the hunter, she dies clean, you live, refuse, and the court declares war." Kieran felt Mara's shock pulse through the link, felt her waiting to see what he'd choose, and realized she actually thought he might consider the offer. Hela continued talking, her words designed to cut. "You'll lose everything, Kieran. Your position, your power, your precious control, all for one human girl who was sent to kill you, one fragile mortal who'll be dead in 60 years anyway." Kieran met Hela's eyes and said with absolute certainty that she's worth more than 60 years. She's worth every century I've lived, and every one I have left. Tell Cassia I'm coming for her, and I'm bringing the hunter with me. The words hung in the blood-soaked air like a declaration of war, which they were, and Hela's expression shifted from confident to uncertain as she realized Kieran meant every syllable. She fled into the tunnels moving with vampire speed, and Kieran let her go because he needed Cassia to know exactly what was coming. Silence crashed over the archive in the wake of violence, broken only by the drip of water from damaged pipes and the harsh, ragged sound of 2 people trying to catch their breath. Emergency lights flickered overhead, casting everything in unstable shadows that made the bodies and ash look like abstract art. Mara slid down against a subway support pillar, her burned arm cradled against her chest, and felt exhaustion hit her like a physical weight. Kieran was kneeling in front of her before she registered him moving, his hands shaking as he reached for her injured arm. "You just declared war on your own kind," Mara said, and her voice came out raw and scraped. "For me." "Not for you," Kieran corrected, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "With you, there's a difference." Mara felt tears threatening and blinked them back because she'd cried enough tonight, had cried for Elena and for the lies and for everything she'd thought she knew that had turned out to be fiction. "What if we lose?" she asked, and heard the fear in her own voice. "Then we lose together," Kieran said simply. And through the empathic link, Mara felt the absolute truth of his words, felt that he would rather die fighting beside her than live by handing her over to Cassia's mercy. Something shifted between them in that moment, some final wall crumbling under the weight of shared violence and mutual protection. Mara reached up with her good hand and touched Kieran's face, let her fingers trace the line of his jaw, and watched his eyes close as he leaned into her touch like a man starving for contact. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it for everything, for choosing her over his throne, for fighting beside her, for seeing her as more than a weapon someone else had aimed. Kieran opened his eyes, and the gold flecks in them caught the emergency lighting. "I can't lose you," he said, and his voice had gone rough with emotion. "I don't understand it, but I can't." And through the link, Mara felt exactly what he meant, felt the depth of his caring that went beyond strategy or alliance or debt. She felt the same thing rising in her own chest, terrifying and undeniable. The recognition that somewhere in the last few hours she'd stopped tolerating him and started falling for him. Kieran took Mara's burned hand gently, so gently it made her throat tighten, and bit his own wrist before she could ask what he was doing. He let a few drops of his blood fall onto her blistered skin, and she watched in fascination as the burns started to heal, not completely, but enough that the pain receded from screaming to manageable. "It's not a ritual," he explained quietly. "Just a gift. Vampires can heal small wounds if we choose to share blood this way." Mara watched her skin knit itself back together and felt through the link his desperate need to take care of her, to fix what had been broken, protecting him. The archive around them was destroyed. Elena's lifework shredded and burned and scattered across concrete that was slick with blood. And Mara knew they should move, should get out before Cassia sent reinforcements, but she couldn't make herself stand. She was so tired, bone-deep exhausted in the way that came after adrenaline burned off and left only the hollow ache of survival. Kieran seemed to understand because he didn't push, just stayed kneeling in front of her close enough that she could see every detail of his face, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the careful control he maintained even now when the empathic link betrayed exactly how much he was feeling. They sat in the ruins of Elena's archive while the city hummed overhead, completely unaware that a war had just been declared in the tunnels beneath Grand Central. The emergency lights flickered and steadied and flickered again, casting moving shadows across walls that had been covered in decades of research and were now just smoke-stained concrete. Mara thought about how 24 hours ago she'd been a waitress with a secret and a mission, thought about how she'd gone to work planning to stake Kieran Nocturne through the heart, and instead had saved him and bound herself to him in ways she was only beginning to understand. "You should have taken the deal," she said finally, testing the words to see if she meant them. Kieran's response was immediate and absolute. "Never," he said, and the word was a vow that echoed in the space between them. Through the link, Mara felt his certainty, felt that he would burn his kingdom to ash before he'd hand her over to Cassia. And the knowledge settled into her bones with a weight that was both terrifying and comforting. She was falling in love with a vampire, and it violated everything the Ordo Draconis had stood for, everything Elena had taught her about keeping distance and maintaining objectivity. But sitting here with Kieran's blood healing her burns and his emotions bleeding through the link like watercolors, Mara couldn't bring herself to regret it. The attraction between them was a living thing now, acknowledged if not acted on, and the air felt charged with possibility and fear and the recognition that they'd just committed to something that would likely get them both killed. Kieran's hand was still holding hers, his cold fingers wrapped around her warmer ones, and neither of them moved to break the contact. Above them, Manhattan slept and schemed and went about its business, and below them in the West Village, Cassia Varn was probably already planning her next move, but for this moment in the flickering emergency lights of a destroyed archive, Mara and Kieran had survived together, and that felt like enough. Mara surfaced from the tunnels into Grand Central's main hall at 2:47 in the morning, and the space felt vast and holy in its emptiness, all marble and echoes, and the kind of silence that only existed in places designed to hold thousands when they held no one at all. She was limping badly, her burned arm throbbing despite Kieran's blood having taken the worst edge off, and he was supporting most of her weight with an arm around her waist that felt both necessary and intimate. Isla appeared from the shadows near the information booth like she'd been conjured, her face unreadable as she took in their blood-soaked clothes and the way they were leaning on each other like neither could stand alone. She had a car waiting, a medical kit in one hand, and news that made Mara's exhausted brain struggle to process. Cassia has called an emergency convening of the vampire court, Isla said without preamble. Dawn, technically this morning in about 4 hours, she'll move to strip you of your title and declare you rogue for consorting with a hunter. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, because Mara understood enough about vampire politics to know what rogue meant. Understood that if Kieran didn't appear, he'd be forfeit, and if he did appear, Cassia would have him killed in the court chamber in front of witnesses who'd call it justice. It's a trap either way, Isla continued, and her voice held something that might have been sympathy if Isla were capable of such things. Then we don't go, Mara said immediately, feeling panic spike through her chest at the thought of Kieran walking into a room designed to kill him. Kieran shook his head, and Mara felt through the empathic link his resignation and his determination. I have to, he said quietly. It's the only way to expose what she did. Kill her claim before she kills me. If I run, she wins by default, and the court will hunt me until one of them gets lucky. Mara refused to accept this, refused to let him face Cassia alone, and said so with enough vehemence that Isla raised an eyebrow. Kieran refused right back, said he wouldn't let Mara walk into a room full of vampires who wanted her dead, and the argument that followed was brutal because the empathic link made lying impossible and amplified every emotion until Mara could barely tell where her terror at losing him ended and his desperation to keep her safe began. They argued in Isla's car while she drove them uptown, through streets that were empty except for garbage trucks and the occasional taxi, argued past rational discussion into the kind of repetitive circle that came from two stubborn people who cared too much to back down. Finally, Mara played her last card, the one she'd been holding since they'd fled the archive. Elena's journal, she said, cutting through Kieran's latest protestation. The entry about Cassia requesting the meeting, it's proof of premeditation. If we bring it to the court and make Cassia answer for it publicly, we split her support because some of them will turn on her. Mara watched realization dawn across Kieran's face, watched him work through the political implications, and felt through the link the moment he understood she was right. They spent the rest of the drive formulating a plan that was equal parts desperate and brilliant, built on ancient vampire law that Kieran explained in quick, urgent sentences. Mara would enter the court chamber as his formally invited guest, which invoked protection laws old enough that breaking them would dishonor not just Cassia, but anyone who allowed harm to come to a guest under official hospitality. She would present the evidence, read Elena's journal entry aloud, where the entire court could hear it, and Kieran would call for Cassia's trial under the blood accords, which were older than most of the vampires who'd be in that room. It was risky in ways that made Mara's stomach clench, because if the court sided with Cassia, they'd both die, but it was the only play that didn't end in war, or Kieran's execution, or Mara spending the rest of her life running from vampires who wanted revenge. They returned to Kieran's penthouse as the sky started to lighten from black to deep blue, 4 hours until the convening, and Mara felt exhaustion pulling at her like gravity. Kieran showed her to a bathroom that was all black marble and glass, and she stood under water hot enough to hurt until her skin turned pink and the worst of the blood and ash washed away. She found her ruined waitress uniform in a pile on the floor, the white shirt stained beyond saving with vampire blood and holy water and her own fear sweat, and she burned it in the kitchen sink because some things shouldn't be salvaged. Kieran's closet held shirts that cost more than Mara's monthly rent, and she borrowed one in black silk that hung to her thighs and smelled like him, like cold winter air and old books and something underneath that was just his scent. When she emerged, he was standing by the windows watching the sky lighten over Manhattan, the city waking up below them in increments of traffic and early risers, and the kind of mundane normal that felt impossible after the night they'd had. Mara joined him at the window, and they stood in silence watching light creep across the skyline until Kieran spoke. "If this goes wrong," he said, "if I don't make it out." Mara cut him off immediately because she couldn't bear to hear him plan for his own death. "Don't," she said, but Kieran turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes made her throat tighten. "I need you to know," he said. "These 2 days with you, I've felt more alive than I have in 800 years. The confession hit Mara like a physical thing, and she felt tears threatening again because she understood exactly what he meant, felt it echoing in her own chest. "I was supposed to kill you," she said, stepping closer until they were barely a hand's width apart. "I had the shot, but when I looked at you I saw." And she trailed off. "Because how did you explain that moment of recognition? That instant when you saw someone else's loneliness reflected back at you?" "Someone as lonely as you," Kieran finished. And Mara nodded because yes, exactly that. She'd looked into his eyes in that restaurant and seen 8 centuries of isolation that mirrored her own 3 months of grief. The empathic link hummed between them, a living thing made of want and fear and hope, and the desperate need to hold on to something good before the world took it away. Kieran cupped her face in his hands, cold fingers against her warm skin, and asked permission with his eyes, the way he'd asked permission for everything since the moment she'd saved him. Mara closed the distance and kissed him, felt him make a sound low in his throat as his arms came around her waist and pulled her closer. The kiss tasted like blood from where she'd bitten her lip earlier, and salt from tears. She hadn't realized she was crying, and something underneath that was just them. Just this moment of connection in a penthouse above a city that was trying to kill them both. It was slow and desperate and inevitable, the kind of kiss that felt like coming home to a place you'd never been. When they broke apart, Mara was breathing hard and Kieran's eyes had gone dark with want. And through the link she felt his emotions tangled so completely with hers that she couldn't separate them anymore. "We're going to survive this," she whispered, making it a promise and a prayer. "We'd better," Kieran said, and his voice had gone rough. "I just found something worth living for." They had 3 hours until the court convened, and they spent them in silence mostly, sitting together on the floor by the windows, while the sun rose and the empathic link hummed between them. Mara dozed against Kieran's shoulder and woke to find him watching her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. She thought about how 24 hours ago she'd been planning his death, and now she was planning to stand beside him in front of a room full of vampires who wanted them both dead. Thought about how completely her world had tilted on its axis in the space of one violent night. The city woke below them in shades of gold and orange, and Kieran explained what to expect at the convening, the formal protocols and the hierarchy, and which vampires might be sympathetic to their cause. Mara listened and committed it to memory the way Elena had taught her, sorting information into categories of useful and critical, and potentially life-saving. At 6:30 they dressed. Kieran in a suit that probably cost more than Mara's car, and made him look every inch the king he was. Mara in clothes Isla had brought that actually fit and were sturdy enough to fight in if things went sideways. She strapped her knife to her thigh out of habit, and Kieran didn't comment, just handed her Elena's journal wrapped in protective plastic. The drive to the court chamber took 20 minutes through morning traffic, and Mara spent it feeling Kieran's tension ratchet higher with each passing block. The court met in a repurposed cathedral in the financial district, all Gothic stone and stained glass that cast colored shadows across marble floors. 50 vampires in formal dress turned to watch as Kieran entered with Mara at his side, and the silence that fell was so complete, Mara could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Cassia Varn sat on a dais at the far end of the chamber, and she was exactly as beautiful and terrifying as Mara had imagined. Ancient eyes and a face that looked 30, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's houses. "You brought your pet hunter?" Cassia said, and her voice carried across the stone with perfect clarity. "How sentimental." Kieran's response was immediate and formal, invoking the guest protection law in words that sounded like ritual, and Mara watched Cassia's smile tighten because refusing would dishonor her in front of the entire court. Mara stepped forward, felt 50 pairs of vampire eyes tracking her movement, and presented Elena's journal with hands that shook only slightly. She read the final entry aloud. Elena's words about Cassia requesting a meeting and claiming Kieran had broken their truce. Read the warning about trusting no one, and the court playing long games, and watched the assembled vampires begin to murmur among themselves. Cassia's smile had disappeared entirely now, replaced by cold fury that made her look less human and more like the predator she was. Kieran spoke, and his voice rang through the chamber with the kind of authority that came from 8 centuries of commanding attention. "Elena Korovi held a 60-year truce with me," he said. "Cassia Varn broke it by killing her and framing me. Intending to trigger a war that would eliminate both me and the last hunter, she used our own laws as weapons and murdered a woman who chose peace over violence. I call for her trial under the blood accords." The court exploded into argument. Half the vampires supporting Cassia because power recognized power, and they'd rather back a winner than honor, half swayed by the evidence and Kieran's invocation of ancient law that predated most modern vampires. A vote was called, and Mara watched it happen with her heart in her throat, watched hands raise and fall as vampires chose sides in a conflict that would determine whether she and Kieran walked out of this chamber alive. It was close. So close Mara could barely breathe, but then 3 elder vampires stood, old enough to remember when Elena's truce had been negotiated, old enough to value honor over ambition. They sided with Kieran and the vote tipped, and Cassia was found guilty by a margin so slim it made Mara dizzy. Her sentence was exile, stripped of title and territory, forbidden from entering Manhattan until the end of her immortal life. Cassia stood from her dais, and Mara saw in her eyes the exact moment she decided that if she was going down, she'd take Mara with her. She lunged with vampire speed, crossing the distance between them in a blur, and Mara barely had time to register the attack before Kieran intercepted her. He moved faster than Mara had ever seen him move, faster than should have been possible, and drove a wooden stake through Cassia's heart with a precision that spoke of centuries of practice. Cassia crumbled to ash before she hit the ground, and the silence that followed was absolute and holy and terrible. The court acknowledged Kieran with bowed heads, his position holding by the thinnest of margins, and Mara was recognized as under his protection, which meant untouchable by vampire law for as long as he claimed her. They left the cathedral together as the sun rose fully over Manhattan, Kieran wrapped in a protective cloak that kept the worst of the light off, but still made him wince. "What now?" Mara asked, and her voice sounded small in the morning air. "Now we figure out what comes next," Kieran said. "Together." Mara smiled, despite her exhaustion, despite the fear still thrumming through her system. "I don't even have a job anymore," she said. "I kind of destroyed that restaurant." Kieran laughed, and the sound was so unexpected and genuine that Mara felt something warm unfold in her chest. "I own that restaurant," he said. "You're rehired, or—" and he hesitated like he was afraid to finish the sentence. "You could stay with me, help me rebuild the truce your mentor started, be my—" and he trailed off. "Partner," Mara finished, testing the word. Kieran nodded and Mara took his hand, laced her fingers through his cold ones. "Yeah," she said, "I can do that." Kieran watched Mara walk through his penthouse barefoot, wearing his shirt, and examining his books with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years cataloging information for survival. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls and turned her hair gold, and he thought about how she was here and alive and had chosen him despite every reason not to. The empathic link was fading now. He could feel it loosening like a rope going slack, and in maybe 6 hours, it would dissolve entirely and leave them with only their own emotions. He realized he'd miss the certainty of knowing exactly what she felt. But maybe they didn't need magic anymore to understand each other. She looked up and caught him watching and smiled, the kind of smile that was just for him, and he felt it anyway through the fading link, the warmth and affection, and the fragile beginning of trust that might someday become love if they were careful with it. "Stop staring and help me figure out which of these books are in languages I can actually read," she said, and Kieran crossed to her and pulled her close and kissed her temple. "All the time in the world," he whispered, and for the first time in 800 years he believed it. Believed in futures and possibilities and the idea that loneliness wasn't a permanent condition. The city hummed below them, and the sun climbed higher, and Mara leaned into him like she belonged there. And Kieran thought about Elena's journal and the truce she'd built, and how maybe peace was possible after all, if you were willing to choose it over war, if you were brave enough to save instead of kill, if you found someone who saw your loneliness and met it with their own and decided that together you could build something better than what came before.